Uh, and thank you for that gracious introduction. And I just want to say at the outset how special it is for me to be kind of back with Malaprops, if not at Malaprops, uh, because not only was I able to visit and have a wonderful event at Malaprops with the tour for my first novel, Only Love Can Break Your Heart, but it's a place that goes back for me a really long way. When I was in my college years, I spent a lot of time in the Asheville area and would frequent the store. In my first year out of college, when I was kind of trying to figure out how to be a writer, and at that point, kind of deliberating a more bohemian life, I was sort of living. Uh, uh, a sort of bohemian life, I should say, in Black Mountain, not far
Mhm.
from Asheville. And I was frequently in Malaprops, and some of the first author events that I attended were there. In fact, one that I remember very well, I met Kay Gibbons in Malaprops many years ago. And so it's always been a place that whenever I get a chance to get anywhere near Asheville, I want to be there. It's a place that's really warm, and to me symbolizes perfectly what independent bookstores mean to me. And I'm just really grateful for the support of the ABA and the independent bookstore community, because uh, uh, you know bookstores are home to me, and I can't describe how much they have meant to me in my life, and how special it is for me to go into a bookstore with my children and see them, reached out to and addressed by the employees, and helping them to nurture that love of reading at a young age. This does not happen at Amazon, and I think that while it's both a special thing for me to be with you and a part of your culture, if I can communicate to people, then I think I know you all have a wonderful community in Nashville that supports the store. It's an institution, but both for Malaprops and for all independent bookstores, if you have a local indie, you know, take care of these people. Get in there, and I hope you will buy my book and love it. But if you don't buy my book, buy somebody else's book and buy a t-shirt and buy a coffee mug and keep these stores alive. I think, we're most people I talk to, they're hanging in there through the pandemic, but it certainly isn't ideal for anybody, and we really need to keep these places alive. They're not just businesses or places where you go to buy stuff. They're essential to our sense of community and kind of what we need to move forward, both at the local level and larger, in kind of healing from what we've been through over this past year and the preceding years. Um, I am not from Nashville. I moved here in 2007 to take a job at an independent school, very similar to the one that I describe in The Fortunate Ones, which is called the Yateman School. That's fictional. The school that I work at is named Montgomery Bell Academy. It's a very old independent boys school in Nashville. And when I came here, I'd been a grad student for a number of years, and I've been living the grad student lifestyle, and having a few of those moments there over the course of that time where eating meant you know finding whatever cans were left in the pantry, and scraping coins out of the bottom of the couch. And I sort of got to a point where I knew I needed to get a job, and I got a job in Nashville, and I was really dazzled by it, because one of the things that's sort of interesting about where I work is that the screenwriter of Dead Poets Society attended this high school, famous film that most people are at least aware of if they haven't seen, with the idealistic, virtuosic English teacher played by Robin Williams. And since I was going to be an English teacher, this was like, well, that's so cool. I'm teaching in Dead Poets Society High School. Never mind the fact that the movie doesn't, the school doesn't treat the teacher so well in the end. We're still really proud of it, and there's actually a room in the building where I teach that's named after the movie, to kind of celebrate the love of teaching and the love of poetry. And so, for me, initially it was all gravy, but uh, after I'd been there for a while, I started to think about things that I hadn't really thought about when I just needed to get a job and make a decent living, and kind of move forward with my professional career, in particular, this sort of radical inequality that exists in this city, as in every city. When we moved here, we could not afford to live in a nice neighborhood. We moved to East Nashville, which now is, kind of upscale and chichi and hip and sort of the Williamsburg, Brooklyn of Nashville. But at the time, it was just the place where we could afford to live. And I commuted every day across the river to go to work. And so my neighborhood was very different from the neighborhood where I worked every day. This didn't bother me so much. I wasn't insecure about it. Uh, but the longer I worked there, the more, the sort of, the vast gulf between the community in which I lived and the community in which I worked, just became clear to me. It didn't bother me so much as I just began to really notice it in ways that I hadn't before. And one moment that really kind of distilled this for me was I was a wrestling coach for a long time, and I was driving the team bus, uh, and we happened to cut down Belmead Boulevard, which Belmead is the the enclave of the affluent here in Nashville, which is the neighborhood in which some of the characters in my novel live, all of them eventually. And it's just opulent. If you've never seen it before, it's kind of hard. The first time I drove down it, I just couldn't even believe, where I grew up in a small town in Virginia, there was maybe one house that looked like, every single house on the street going down about a mile. And it really is, you know, majestic. It's not, I suppose it depends on how you feel about architecture, I guess, how you look at, grand opulent houses, but I'm a lover of beauty, and I can admire a beautiful house, even if it's hard for me to imagine living in one. Uh, but so we're driving along, and I've got these guys in the back of the bus, and one of these kids, who I know to be a kid who's on financial aid, on close to full financial aid, is leaning out the window, and he's just gaping at these houses. And he looks up at me, and he was like, "Do people live in these houses? Is that a house, or is that a museum?" And I said, "That's a house, Stephen." And I said, "You never been down Belmead Boulevard before?" And he looked at me and he said, "Coach, I'm from Bordeaux." Well, Bordeaux is in North Nashville, which is, really one of, there are some nice parts, but it's really kind of, where the underclass has sort of been driven, as gentrification has, kind of crowded people out of East Nashville. And I had driven this boy and some of his classmates who were from similar circumstances, home after practice sometime because they needed a ride. And I'd seen where they lived, which, was really, really, really different from where a lot of their classmates lived. And I didn't think that, I never personally observed any kind of, cruelty or snobbery toward these boys, but it occurred to me, wow, as a teenager, as a 12 or 13-year-old kid, to come from, a really, impoverished neighborhood, and go to school every day in this really, really nice affluent school, and to have friends who would invite you over and say, "Come have a sleepover at my house," and you show up at this kid's house, and it looks to you like it should be a museum, and you walk in the front door, and the entry hall's bigger than any house you've ever lived in before. How hard that must be, and how brave those kids had to be to come from circumstances like that into a situation where the kids that they were, going to school with, had absolutely no concept of what it felt like to be needy, or maybe not to be sure that you were going to get to eat on a certain day, uh, and not to take it for granted that you would have a fabulous education and attend whatever university admitted you, and sort of follow this trajectory through life unblemished. I also started to think about how it would feel, or what it would be like to be in the position of not knowing any better than to think that, living in, 6, 7, 8,000 square foot mansion on the most expensive real estate in Tennessee is really, really unusual, and only happens to a very, very, very small fraction of civilization. And that, these people, these kids, they don't, they're mostly pretty good kids. They're mostly, they're just like any other neighborhood in any other part of the world. There's, exceptions, and there are problems, and they have the same issues that everybody else has, but they're mostly pretty good kids. But they have no idea, many of them, it's a just completely remote thing to consider that their world is not kind of normal and, typical. And they get told all the time how fortunate they are, and how, privileged they are, and how blessed they are. But after you've been fed that line, 100 times a year since you were in the first grade, it just becomes kind of noise. And I think that, you know, I started to kind of pay attention to this and look at, and also now that some of my students are adults and I've watched them kind of grow into awareness and become, a lot more conscious than they were when they were teenagers, of, how different their lives were from the lives of, almost everybody else. I started thinking about them too. And I had, a much greater measure of compassion for their experience than, criticism or contempt. And so when it came time for me to write another novel, I thought, I'd like to explore this. I'd like to see if I can't tell a story that illustrates this, sort of profound culture clash, and to, uh, write objectively and empathetically about both sides of this cultural spectrum. Uh, Also, kind of hovering around in all of this in my mind was the issue of race, which is hugely significant in socioeconomic segregation in everywhere in America, but especially in the South. And I wanted to try to address that in a way that was honest and um, unmerciful in terms of how I see the way that those issues, having been neglected and, you know, quite literally whitewashed, because it doesn't feel good to think about ways in which, your privilege might come at the expense of someone else's disadvantage. But it was difficult for me because not, you know, I didn't feel that was my story to tell. And so rather than writing from the perspective of, uh, an African American student at the school, I thought, no, I can't do that. That doesn't belong to me. That would be very difficult for me to do honestly and well. And it would also, make me very, vulnerable to a lot of places where I could, really end up going against the purposes that I had intended. So I decided instead that I would write from the perspective of a boy on financial aid, who was white, entering the school and kind of being welcomed into a wealthy and affluent family, and being sort of dazzled by this, uh, and also sort of being in the position, as many of the white students that I teach who are on financial aid, of being a little bit more sort of invisible. It's ironic because there's an assumption that any person of color in the school must be on financial aid, and all the white kids are paying full tuition, when in reality there's actually quite a few students of color whose parents are very affluent and are doctors and lawyers and financial planners who have done very, very well. uh, and there are also boys who just kind of slip in like chameleons, who are white, who are very, very, lower middle class. One of my former students who I love dearly I don't think any of his friends ever knew that his dad worked the night shift in a cookie factory. He was kind of incognito, so to speak. And I thought, well, isn't that sort of that's something that I can do. That's something that I can do without, uh, you know, being appropriating or stepping into territory that doesn't belong to me. But I nevertheless wanted to write a story that would, uh, you know, not sidestep the realities of you know race in this issue of the gap between the haves and the have-nots that is most profoundly observable, I think, in southern cities. I also became really interested in uh, the idea of how people who are raised in this environment and this the whole concept of noblesse oblige, this idea that if you're wealthy and kind of have these connections and this influence, that it is both your obligation and your birthright to lead, to go into public service, to go into politics. Um, you know, Many Southern politicians, if not most, uh, are not bootstraps guys. They're people who were kind of born to the manor, and even some of the better and more generous and effective politicians that we've had in this country have been born with that sense of it's my right and my obligation to go and do this. In the South and in Tennessee, they tend to be Republicans. And I, uh, again, coming into this community, one of the things that struck me after having been a grad student and in university culture for the previous, however many years, and kind of, being kind of finding my politics pushing me to the left of Trotsky, was that uh, all these, affluent Republicans were like really nice people. They were really kind. They really seemed to care about things that I thought were important to care about. And nevertheless, they supported politicians who it seemed to me to be, you know, maybe a little bit more obviously, hypocritical or contradictory because of my own political, leanings. Maybe I'm less inclined to see those faults in the people that are supporting the policies that I, you know, personally think are the right ones. But nevertheless, it just seemed like a contradiction to me. So I kind of wanted to write about that. I wanted to write about, somebody who goes into politics and public service and, starts maybe being a little bit hypocritical or dishonest because he feels that that is what is necessary in order for him to do good. And then somewhere along the line, loses track and kind of loses his way uh, in terms of understanding the difference between what we might call a necessary evil and just a straight up evil. So that was where I began, and then maybe about a third of the way into it, um, Donald Trump was elected president, and aside from my general kind of disbelief about the situation, you know, it's just like everybody else. I believe the polls, and was just watching the returns come in with my jaw hanging down around the floor. I also suddenly thought, wow, how this is suddenly my novel has got real problems because reality just went way past anything that I could imagine or fictionalize. And it was a kind of a crisis of conscience for a while there. Like, can I even write this book? How am I going to do it? Uh, what are the priorities going to be? How am I going to depict this in a way that isn't going to feel false or clueless or incompatible with reality? But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that what's really at stake here is you know, entitlement, which is something that we see and have seen in a really, really profound way in the past just few weeks. And also the way in which poor people people who really, should not love rich people, nevertheless, end up being kind of entranced by this idea of wealth and privilege. And particularly, one of the things that's bothered me more than anything else that just seemed to become much more profound over the course of my adult life is this idea that, you know, success equals, that affluence and success are synonyms, and that what we should all be going after in life is to pile up a bunch of money. And that if you pile up a bunch of money and you're really wealthy, then that means you're smart and you know what's right and you ought to be in charge. And I just wasn't raised that way. I was raised that it wasn't how much you have, it's how much good you can do, and whether or not you can create something, or whether or not, if what you love and what you do happens to make you affluent, oh, congratulations, that's absolutely wonderful. But the point isn't to me, wasn't to end up, the good people weren't the people who were the richest. They were the people who did the most helpful and interesting and intelligent and uh, innovative things. And it seems like, certainly over the last couple of years, we sort of lost track of that, and that, wealth and principle are not the same thing. And so it just kind of came back around to me as I was working my way toward the end, that, okay, well, maybe this isn't, maybe it's a more subtle way of looking at something that in real life has become so caricaturish that you can't really, learn anything meaningful from it. You just, it's so obviously, you know, wrongheaded that it obscures the fact that there are still real problems of understanding in how we think about, wealth and purpose and meaning and what is good and, how to live. Uh, so, by the time we actually were taking it to press, I felt like, okay, you know, maybe a book about, you know, a wealthy businessman who kind of on a whim decides to go into politics, and just from sheer charm and charisma, rises with ease and, does, things without principle or any purpose other than, to win. Maybe that's a story that is on time.
I'd say so. And yours is not the only book that turns out to seem sort of prescient in that way, and particularly timely, because one of the things that we talk about periodically is the way the timelines of books work. Books are released, and a book lands, and you read it, and you're like, oh my gosh, this is channeling reality in this remarkable way. How did they know? And not thinking about the fact that certainly that's the seed for the the first seed of the book might be years and years old, and just the publishing process alone is is more than a year. And still, this is incredibly timely. And the thing about it that feels most timely to me is this idea that you were talking about, where I think there are so many people in the country right now who are not physically perhaps, but sort of psychologically and emotionally and spiritually in Charlie's position, in your protagonist's position, in terms of being faced with feeling embraced by people, with all of this privilege that renders them immune from consequence to a large degree, and having to decide how to behave, what to accept, what to allow ethically, what to pay attention to, what not to, what to think is okay,
Mhm.
in that framework. And it feels like a lot of people are sort of faced with that, as we, as you describe, we kind of look at material wealth and success as a result of goodness somehow, a sort of proof of moral worth, when certainly it isn't. And so I wonder if you could just take a moment on, now that this is the reality that sort of matches the book,
Mhm.
kind of sort of how you navigate dealing very thoughtfully with those kinds of considerations, for the characters in your book.
Um, I think that, part of what I wanted to do when I started was, just to be honest about the way, and I've certainly experienced this in my life where I've found myself sort of flung into situations where I'm, surrounded by people who, have a lot more than I had growing up. And I certainly didn't grow up I mean, I was comfortable in my family. My parents, were, they did care of me, but not at the level of which, some people live. Uh, just being dazzled by it, being even in my writing career, I've, been invited to do events, in, absolutely beautiful, fabulous homes, by people who, are, just at a level of affluence that I couldn't dream of. And, you know, I have to admit, like, when I'm walking around in one of these places, I'm like, this is pretty nice, I mean, I don't know that I could get used to living like this, but I sure don't mind, gaping at the artwork, and uh, just I don't think that what I wanted to do was you know, to tear down the idea. I mean, it's certainly debatable as to whether or not anybody ought to live like that, but that wasn't my purpose. It was really more along the lines of trying to depict how, you know, anybody, I think, many people, if not most people, when, you know, invited into that world and treated really well and welcomed by people who are, you know, you know, really polished and well mannered and have beautiful clothes and beautiful homes and are groomed in a way that uh, is, sort of indicative or typical or has all the sort of the tags of great wealth and privilege, that you would be really impressed by that and maybe think to yourself, it wouldn't be so bad. I've often thought that, kind of the problem that we have and the reason why so many people vote against their own economic self-interest is because, you know, what people want down deep is not, fair and equal. It's, the idea that, maybe one day I too can be, maybe, somebody's going to make my fortune. I was teaching my students not too long ago about the Horatio Alger myth or the Horatio Alger plot, and it's a plot that I think is often, you know, misread or misunderstood. Most people think that it's this sort of American dream story, but every single Horatio Alger novel is about how, the young protagonist who has a good heart and really sort of deserves better than his impoverished lot in life manages to, by circumstance, do some service to a fabulously wealthy person or be observed by a fabulously wealthy person doing some good deed. And that fabulously wealthy person decides to make that guy's fortune and elevate him. And it's not this idea that you work your way up to, achieve something great, by patience and chutzpah and good luck and the sort of American values of work hard and it's all going to, go your way. It's overnight success. It's the idea that, somebody out there is just going to decide to make you the man. And, when people kind of find that possibility sort of dangled before them like a carrot at the end of the stick, they're going to follow it. They've been doing that really, as long as this country's been around. In fact, it's a big part of the reason why this country is even here in the first place, is people wanting to go west with the idea, we're gonna, plunder this land and have, overnight success. We're gonna find gold. I mean, they didn't come here looking for, tobacco farms. They came here looking for gold when the Jamestown colony was founded. And it was pretty mercenary. And so, I felt like, by showing that world through the eyes of somebody who has grown older and is now reflecting on these experiences with some skepticism, or at least, sort of chastened by what he's learned by it, that I could simultaneously show, the allure and how, particularly a young kid would, just bite that carrot and never let go. But then how he could also sort of simultaneously critique this world and himself. What I hope comes across is that I think Charlie is pretty unmerciful, pretty scathing in his critique of everything that he lives through, but he does not excuse himself from the criticism. He's now able to kind of look back at his own, naivete and selfishness and sort of greed or materialism, and see it for what it is. He doesn't spare himself. He doesn't mean for us to think that he's on some sort of higher moral plane than everybody else. And so I thought that might be a way both to tell a meaningful story about how this weird thing happens where people vote against their self-interest and become kind of devoted in the cult of personality to a person who really just doesn't care about them at all, and thinks that they're subhuman and doesn't really actually want to touch them or be near them. And also to make some peace with my own experience in the past, both distant and recent, of being seduced by the same things and kind of buying into these things at times and still feeling a sort of conflict about just what ought to be the case in the way that we live in this country. What are the limits by many people's standards? My stand by gosh, probably about 85% of the world, if not more, my standard of living, which is radically lower than the characters that I describe, is really, really, really high. Is in the things that I enjoy and the luxuries that I take for granted. Is that fair? Who am I to criticize people like Arch and the Haltons when I'm living pretty comfortably compared to the people who are living in the homeless camp about 2 miles from here and not feeling guilty about it. So I wanted to try and be, as objective as possible about these issues of class and wealth, and not just heap contempt on people who have never known anything but a standard of living that is, beyond the dreams of most people on planet Earth.
Sorry, I just forgot about unmuting there for a second.
Sure.
And I think you've done that really well. And as I said, you have been thoughtful about that, because it's not useful to commit the same error on the other side. To just like we can't assume moral superiority because of a large bank account. We can't, assume a lack of morality because of a large bank account. And as you say, for everyone, our normal is our normal, at least until something comes along to suggest otherwise, right? And so I would like to invite you, before we get to questions, and I'll remind folks to post questions in chat. And then I have another question as well. I'd like to invite you to read a little bit, just to give us a little taste of the fortunate ones, and then we'll move forward.
I'd be happy to do that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read basically two very short sections. One's just a paragraph, and the other's two paragraphs from two different parts of the novel. The first one I'll read is actually from the beginning of chapter 1. Now, there's a prologue to the novel in which Charlie discovers, this isn't a big spoiler, that Arch, who has since gone on to, so Charlie, my narrator, is a poor kid growing up, but at the beginning of the novel, he's in the Army, and he's a veteran of the Iraq War. That's about 2014, and he is in the midst of delivering a casualty notification to the family of a soldier who's been killed, probably in a roadside bomb. And while he's doing this, the family has the television news on, and on the television news, he sees that the Republican senator from Tennessee, a young senator named Arch Cray, has committed suicide. And he has a very, very powerful reaction to this, because as it turns out, he and Arch were very, very close in their childhood. And so he then goes back and begins to tell this story of how he came to know Arch and be drawn into his affluent family, and sort of how they grew together and apart, and then back together again, and then finally apart. And so the first paragraph of chapter 1 reads, "When I learned what had happened to Arch, what he'd done, when I saw him there on the TV screen in the living room of a dead soldier's family and wept, I thought not of what he'd become, but rather of a boy I once knew, with a mop of golden hair and a golden smile and a sense of certitude so strong it spilled onto everyone around him. And I thought of the boy I had once been, aimless and timid, and how when that magnificent boy turned his light toward me, I fed on that light, and in doing so, became transformed." Now, the second short section occurs much later in the novel, when the boys have become adults and Arch is beginning to enter political life, and he's preparing to announce his candidacy for mayor of Nashville, prior to then eventually going on to become a senator. And he's getting ready to give his speech. He's going to use the platform of being invited to be commencement speaker at their alma mater, at the boys' alma mater, the school that I was talking about, as the place where he's going to announce his candidacy. In the midst of this, Charlie, observing Arch, says, "How did a guy like Arch Cray, born into wealth, educated privately from pre-K through graduate school, married to the daughter of a billionaire, as handsome as a film star, with family ties going back almost to Jamestown, become a man of the people? After all, the people were the ones who shopped at Walmart, who spent their lives traveling back and forth between backbreaking jobs and weary inertia at home, who ended up being forced to live off disability and Medicaid benefits. How on earth could the people see a guy who lived on Belmead Boulevard as their champion? There is nothing in this world to which people connect more willingly in uncertain times than the appearance of genuine certainty. If there was one true thing that could be said about Arch, it was this: he seemed so sure of himself that people couldn't help but believe in him." That's that's what I wanted to read.
And yeah, and that's it right there. That's a lot. Thank you for those selections. It's a lot right there. And I love that you chose that, because there's the phrase, quote unquote, the American people, for instance, has been something that's grated me for quite some time. Yeah, and I thought a lot about, I thought quite a bit about two books when thinking about your book. One was It Can't Happen Here. And then the other, of course, is The Great Gatsby. And there is a wonderful review quote by Paula McLain about your book. Let me just pull it up here. Paul McLain, who wrote the Paris Wife, said, "The Fortunate Ones feels like a fresh and remarkably sure-footed take on The Great Gatsby." And then goes on to say that your understanding of the human heart and mind is deep, wise, and uncommonly empathetic. And so, not to give too much airtime to F. Scott Fitzgerald, because that's not why we're here, but I wonder if you would take a moment, especially since The Great Gatsby now, interesting enough, is sort of in the news. You know, it's now in the public domain, and there are more new editions coming out. And I think it is worth taking a moment, just as a point of entry, to look at sort of where the Fortunate Ones might connect to and diverge from, you know, that story that people are so familiar with, or at least think they are.
Sure. Well, I should begin by just saying how incredibly flattered I was that Paula McLain said those really, really generous things about my work. I'm a great admirer of hers, and I have really been fascinated and kind of, you know, stood in awe of the way she has gone and kind of, you know, reinvented this world of the lost generation in multiple novels now. And I don't think there are too many people out there, certainly not very many novelists, who have more authority on the subject than Paula. So, you know, boy, that really just hit me as wow, just deeply humbling and you know, obviously, you know, flattering and gratifying thing for her to say. And I'm very, very grateful to her. That being said, um, honestly, it wasn't until Paula made that observation that I even thought about how strongly connected this story is to The Great Gatsby. I have taught it, but not recently. Well, I did last year, but I'd already finished the book at that point. And I never really consciously thought about that book at all, not once, you know, crossed my heart and hope to die. Really, the book that I was thinking about mostly when it came to the issue of class was Brideshead Revisited by Evelyn Waugh, which was kind of the main inspiration for me when I was sitting there going, around the time I was thinking about writing this book about, you know, the culture clash that I was speaking to before. I read Brideshead Revisited for the first time, and it just blew my mind. I just loved it, and I thought, well, this is kind of, I would like to write a kind of, you know, American South version of this. Also, you know, kind of, I wanted to write a cross between Brideshead Revisited and All the King's Men. But once that observation had been made, once Paula said that, I thought about it, and I kind of was like, gosh, she's right. I mean, not that it's a great intentional take on The Great Gatsby, and the comparison is incredibly flattering, but I realized that, boy, I really did. I guess I just really internalized that book because I do love it. And I was observing to a friend the other day how years ago I had set out to underline every perfect sentence in The Great Gatsby, and I gave up after about page 3 because I realized, you know, I'd have to underline pretty much the whole book. It's just so beautifully written. And I also realized upon review, boy, I really did internalized this story. And maybe that's why people talk about it as, kind of a contender for the great American novel, because maybe it's just so archetypal. And then I thought about it some more and I thought, okay, what I really see happening in my book that is similar to The Great Gatsby is how, my narrator, Charlie, is sort of like a cross between Nick and Gatsby. Nick is the guy who's sort of from, he's not, Buchanan rich, but he's not poor. He went to Yale, and, in the beginning of the story, we're told his father telling him, don't judge people whose advantages you don't share. Gatsby's the guy who, falls in love with the girl and thinks that, all I got to do is, have the money and I'll get the girl and then I'm going to be somebody. And so I kind of took those two guys and made them one person. And in many other ways, there's a lot of, thematic resonance in terms of the entitlement of the rich people. And certainly, gosh, the beautiful affluent girl, for anybody who went to high school in the United States post 1960, as the kind of, that archetype in American literature is Daisy in The Great Gatsby, whether she deserves it or not. I have to tell my students, I'm like, she's not very nice. We really shouldn't want them to get together. Like they're not. She's not a good person. But when you're a kid, you just you get captivated by the idea of the beauty. But then I started thinking about it and I was like, okay, but isn't this also true in Great Expectations, right? Isn't Pip a guy who is willing to make all kinds of moral compromises to get the girl who isn't very nice and who becomes completely, infatuated with the wealthy, even though their lives are, obviously full of, corruption and dysfunction, and is willing to, betray the good people in his life in order to get closer to the people who are very obviously not very nice. And you can do this all day. I put this to my students not too long ago. I was like, name one novel that you've read in school, or even a movie, where the guy you're supposed to root for is the guy who was born rich. Name one story that you've read in school that, doesn't depict, the guy who is born with all the advantages as, being flawed and morally compromised. It's hard to do. The only one we could come up with is Pride and Prejudice. And, Darcy also, has to, get a hard dose of comeuppance before he actually figures out that he's a snob and decides to be a good person. So I guess what I realized was that maybe, and maybe part of the reason, in addition, obviously the hype right now is because of the copyright, expiring and the book entering the public domain. But the enduring popularity and value of it, of The Great Gatsby, and the reason why this story keeps getting kind of reinvented, by myself and others, is because it connects to a deep archetype that we're all, sort of irresistibly attracted to. And that is exactly what we've been talking about, the simultaneous admiration and envy or resentment of the people who appear to live lives, untouched by struggle.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, thank you for that. And you're right. You start to think about when the born rich person is the plucky hero, and that doesn't quite that doesn't quite happen.
If anyone out there can tell me one that I can look up, I'd love to hear about it.
Yeah, I'm gonna be chewing on that one for a while now, I think. That's a great question for all of our readers to take home with them and kind of think about. So before we finish up, we do have a question from Sarah, who has read the book and enjoyed it
Oh, thank you,
And
Sarah.
so it's a specific question, asking what your inspiration was for the character Teddy Whitten. Um, and then Sarah says specifically, I love the way, oh, well, maybe I won't get that specific. Sarah had asked about spoilers and stuff, but suffice to say, Sarah loves the character, and what you did with the character. I was curious.
That's a really good question. Um, I think that there were probably, multiple sort of inspirations, uh, but what I wanted more than anything else, and I can't get too personal here because it's kind of private, where sort of specifically who I was thinking about uh, when I created the character, a person that I knew a long, long time ago, uh, you know, who passed away tragically, and I've just always kind of, she's one of those people that haunts my memory, and I, kind of wanted to tell a story about her. Um, but when thematically, what I wanted with the character was, uh, an outsider who, you know, could kind of both mentor Charlie and give him a kind of, escape hatch really from the world that he's living in, and also someone uh, who would, encourage his artistry. Charlie becomes a painter, and that was something that was really important to me, that he, uh, you know, have a plausible path into that life. And I also, there's a section in the novel that takes place in San Miguel de Allende, Mexico, where I've spent some time, and I was interested in exploring that. I actually wrote a lot of the book when I was down there, and the arts community there. And I also wanted to, uh, use what opportunities were afforded to me to represent the LGBTQ community, and address sort of how that, you know, subtext of life in the, particularly in the 80s and the 90s, before things got much more open, and much more tolerant, anywhere, but especially in the South. um, how that might play into the lives of these kids that are growing up in extremely macho and heteronormative culture. And she seemed like, uh, uh, a good person to do that. I will say, in earlier drafts of the novel, there was much more Teddy. Uh, I think it's okay now, but maybe I'll write her story one day too.
I was just going to ask that question, if you might have plans um, to do more with the character.
I don't know. I
Yeah.
mean, if I do, she'll probably have a different name and be in a different context, but she's definitely a person that interests me, and whose story I think there's much more to be told. And that's not that Sarah's not the first person to ask me that question. My sister, that's the first thing she says, like, I want to know more about Teddy.
Yeah.
I said, I'll have to write that book one day.
Well, we can keep an eye out for the character
Please.
popping up with maybe with another name and face.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, Ed, this has just been wonderful. Thank you for sharing with us this evening. And before we go, very quickly, and I apologize for not asking you backstage, as it were, but we'd like to ask authors if they have any recommendations. And I wonder if there is maybe a book that jumps out that you would like to tell folks that they should pick up.
Well, the book that I'm really raving about right now is actually a work of nonfiction by James Shapiro, called Shakespeare in a Divided America. And I'm sure you have it on your shelves. It's pretty new. I think it was named a Times Notable Book for 2020.
Yeah.
And James Shapiro is just one of the liveliest writers on the subject of Shakespeare, and it's sort of simultaneously an exploration of it's really kind of about the history of the performance of Shakespeare and his relationship to American history. And I'm not going to give anything away. We're running out of time, but just trust me, it is going to blow you away how many really kind of, resonant parallels there are in what he's saying about things that happened 150 years ago in relationship to the performance of Shakespeare and what we've been living through over the past couple of years, which is both in some ways reassuring and in other ways discouraging, but it's absolutely fantastic. In terms of fiction, I've uh, I've said this before. Um, my dear friend and a major influence on me, Brad Watson, passed away last summer, and his last novel is named Miss Jane. It was a finalist for the National Book Award. But everything that Brad wrote is absolutely fabulous, and I've been deep diving into his work in the months since his departure as a way of kind of being with him and being close to him. And I just really hope that people will continue to read and love Brad's novels. And so if you've never read Brad Watson, they're all brilliant. Miss Jane is it'll blow you away. It's absolutely brilliant.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. Thank you for those recommendations, and again for spending the hour with us, and for the new book, for The Fortunate Ones. And thank you as well for your opening remarks about independent bookstores. And we're, of course, happy to have you back at Malaprops, even though it's not in the store, and really appreciate those thoughts. We again encourage folks to purchase your book if they can, from us, from Malaprops, or from your local indie, wherever you are. And if you don't have an indie or don't know if you have an indie, you can go to indiebound.org and find out, or find one to support. Who's near you. And we hope that folks will join us again for another event. And with that, I'll say thank you again, and wish everyone well. And Ed, any final words before we leave?
Just thank you very, very much. And again, everybody hang tight. The fever is breaking, and celebrate by going and supporting your local independent bookstore.